Natsume Sōseki, Kokoro. Part 1, Sensei and I. Chapter 1. I always called him Sensei, and so I shall do in these pages, rather than reveal his name. It is not that I wish to shield him from public scrutiny, simply that it feels more natural. Sensei springs to my lips whenever I summon memories of this man, and I write of him now with the same reverence and respect. It would also feel wrong to use some conventional initial to substitute for his name and thereby distance him. I first met Sensei in Kamakura in the days when I was still a young student. A friend had gone there during summer vacation for sea bathing and urged me to join him, so I set about organizing enough money to cover the trip. This took me 2 or 3 days. Less than 3 days after I arrived, my friend received a sudden telegram from home demanding that he return. His mother was ill, it seemed. He did not believe it. For some time his parents had been trying to force him into an unwanted marriage. By present-day standards, he was far too young for marriage, and besides, he did not care for the girl in question. That was why he had chosen not to return home for the vacation, as he normally would have, but to go off to a local seaside resort to enjoy himself. He showed me the telegram and asked what I thought he should do. I did not know what to advise, but if his mother really was ill, he clearly should go home. So in the end, he decided to leave. Having come to Kamakura to be with my friend, I now found myself alone. I could stay or go as I pleased, since some time still remained before classes began again, so I decided to stay where I was for the moment. My friend, who was from a prosperous family in the Chugoku region, did not lack of money, but he was student and young, so in fact his standard of living was actually much like my own, and I was spared the trouble of having to find a cheaper inn for myself after he left. The inn he had chosen was somewhere in an out-of-the-way district of Kamakura. To get to any of the fashionable spots, the billiard rooms and ice cream parlors and such things, I had to take a lengthy walk through the rice fields. A rickshaw ride would cost me a full 20 cents. Still, a number of new summer houses stood in the area, and it was right next to the beach, making it wonderfully handy for sea bathing. Each day I went down to the shore for a swim, making my way among soot-blackened, old-thatched country houses. An astonishing number of men and women always thronged the beach, city folk down from Tokyo to escape the summer heat. Sometimes the crowd was so thick that the water was a tightly packed mass of black heads, as in some public bathhouse. Knowing no one, I enjoyed my time alone amid this merry scene, lying on the sand and leaping about up to my knees in the waves. It was here in this throng of people that I first came upon Sensei. In those days, 2 little stalls on the beach provided drinks and changing rooms, and for no particular reason I took to frequenting one of them. Unlike the owners of the grand summer houses in the Hase area, we users of this beach had no private bathing huts, so communal changing rooms were essential. People drank tea and relaxed here, or left their hats and sun umbrellas in safekeeping after they bathed. They would wash themselves down at the stall, and attendants would rinse their bathing suits for them. I owned no bathing clothes, but I left my belongings at the stall whenever I went into the water to avoid having anything stolen. Chapter 2. When I first set eyes on Sensei there, he had just taken off his clothes and was about to go in for a swim, while I had just emerged from the water and was drying off in the sea breeze. A number of black heads were moving around between us, obstructing my view of him, and under normal circumstances, I probably would not have noticed him. But he instantly caught my attention, despite the crowd and my own distracted state of mind, because he was with a Westerner. The Westerner's marvelously white skin had struck me as soon as I came in. He had casually tossed his kimono robe into the nearby bench and then, clad only in a pair of drawers such as which Japanese wear, stood gazing out toward the sea, arms folded. This intrigued me. 2 days earlier I had gone up to Yugahama beach and spent a long time watching the Westerners bathing. I had settled myself on a low dune very close to the rear entrance of a hotel frequented by foreigners and seen a number of men emerge to bath. Unlike this Westerner, however, they all wore clothing that covered their torso, arms, and legs. The women were ever more modest. Most wore red or blue rubber caps that bobbed prettily about among the waves. Because I was so recently observed all that, the sight of this Westerner standing there in front of everyone, wearing only a pair of trunks, struck me as quite remarkable. He turned and spoke a few words to the Japanese man beside him, who had bent over to pick up a small towel that had fallen on the sand. His companion then wrapped the towel about his head and set off toward the sea. This man was Sensei. Out of nothing more than curiosity, my eyes followed the two figures as they walked side by side down to the water. Stepping straight into the waves, they made their way through the boisterous crowd gathered in the shallows close to shore, and when they reached a relatively open stretch of water, both began to swim. They swam on out to sea until their heads looked small in the distance. Then they turned around and swam straight back to the beach. Returning to the stall, they toweled themselves down without rinsing at the well, put on their clothes, and promptly headed off together for some unknown destination. After they left, I sat down on the bench and smoked a cigarette. I wondered idly about Sensei. I felt sure I had seen his face before somewhere, but for the life of me, I could not recall where or when. I was at loose ends and needing to amuse myself, so the following day I went back to the stall at the hour when I had seen Sensei. Sure enough, there he was again. This time he came along wearing a straw hat, and the Westerner was not with him. He removed his spectacles and set them on the bench, then wrapped a small towel around his head and set off briskly down the beach. As I watched him make his way through the crowd at the edge and start to swim, I had a sudden urge to follow him. In I strode, the water splashing high around me, and when I reached a reasonable depth, I set my sights on him and began to swim. I did not reach him, however. Rather than return the way he had come, as he did the previous day, Sensei had swum in an arc back to the beach. I too swam back, and as I emerged from the water and entered the stall, shaking the drops from my hands, he passed me on his way out, already neatly dressed. Chapter 3. The next day I went to the beach at the same hour yet again, and again I saw Sensei there. I did the same the day after, but never found an opportunity to speak to him or even to greet him. Besides, Sensei's demeanor was rather forbidding. He would arrive at the same time each day with an unapproachable air and depart just as punctually and aloofly. He seemed quite indifferent to the noisy throng that surrounded him. The Westerner who had been with him that first day never reappeared. Sensei was always alone. Finally my chance came. Sensei had as usual come striding back from the swim. He was about to don the kimono that lay as usual on the bench when he found that it had somehow gotten covered in sand. As he turned away and quickly shook it out, I saw his spectacles, which had been lying on the bench beneath it, slip through a crack between the boards and fall to the ground. Sensei put on the rope and wrapped the sash around his waist. Then, evidently noticing that his spectacles were missing, he quickly began to search for them. In a moment, I had dug down, thrust my hand under the bench and retrieved them from the ground. "Thank you," he said as he took them. The next day, I followed Sensei into the sea and swam after him. I had gone about 200 yards when he suddenly stopped swimming and turned to speak to me. We two were the only beings afloat on the blue expanse of water for a considerable distance. As far as the eye could see, strong sunlight blazed down upon sea and mountains. As I danced wildly in place there in the water, I felt my muscles float with a sensation of freedom and delight. Sensei, meanwhile, ceased to move and lay floating tranquilly on his back. I followed his example and felt the sky's azure strike me full in the face, as if plunging its glittering shafts of color deep behind my eyes. "Isn't this good?" I cried. After a little while, Sensei righted himself in the water and suggested we go back. Being physically quite strong, I would have liked to stay longer, but I instantly and happily agreed. The two of us swam back to the bench the way we had come. From this point on, Sensei and I were friends, yet I still had no idea where he was staying. On the afternoon of the third day since our swim, he suddenly turned to me when we met at the stall. "Are you planning to stay here a while longer?" he asked. I had not thought about it and had no ready answer. "I don't really know," I responded simply. But the grin on Sensei's face made me suddenly awkward and I found myself asking, "What about you, Sensei?" This was when I first began to call him by that name. That evening I called on him at his lodgings. I said lodgings, but I discovered it was no ordinary place. He was staying in a villa in the spacious grounds of a temple. Those who shared the place, I also discovered, were not related to him. Noticing how he grimaced wearily when I persisted in calling him Sensei, I excused myself with the explanation that this was a habit of mine when addressing my elders. I asked him about the Westerner he had been with. The man was quite eccentric, he said, adding that he was no longer in Kamakura. He told me a lot of other things about him, then remarked that it was odd that he, who had few social contacts even with his fellow Japanese, should have become friends with such a person. At the end of our conversation, I told him that I felt I knew him from somewhere but could not remember where. Young as I was, I hoped that he might share my feelings and was anticipating his answer. But after a thoughtful pause, he said, "I can't say I recall your face. Perhaps you're remembering somebody else." His words produced in me a strange disappointment. Chapter 4. At the end of the month, I returned to Tokyo. Sensei had left the summer resort long since. When we parted, I had asked him, "Would you mind if I visited you from time to time?" "Yes, do," he replied simply. By this time, I felt we were on quite familiar terms and had expected a warmer response. This unsatisfactory reply rather wounded my self-confidence. Sensei frequently disappointed me in this way. He seemed at times to realize it and at other times to be quite oblivious. Despite all the fleeting shocks of disappointment, however, I felt no desire to part ways with him. On the contrary, whenever some unexpected terseness of his shook me, my impulse was to press forward with the friendship. It seemed to me that if I did so, my yearning for the possibilities of all he had to offer would someday be fulfilled. Certainly I was young, yet the youthful candor that drew me to him was not evident in my other relationships. I had no idea why I should feel this way towards Sensei alone. Now, when he is dead, I understand at last. He had never disliked me, and the occasional curt greetings and aloofness were not expressions of displeasure intended to keep me at bay. I pity him now, for I realized that he was in fact sending a warning to someone who was attempting to grow close to him, signaling that he was unworthy of such intimacy. For all his unresponsiveness to others' affection, I now see it was not them he despised but himself. Needless to say, I returned to Tokyo fully intending to visit Sensei. Classes would not resume for another 2 weeks, so I planned to visit him during that day. However, within 2 or 3 days of my arrival in Tokyo, my feelings began to shift and blur. The city's vibrant atmosphere, reviving as it did all my stimulating memories, swept away thoughts of Kamakura. Seeing my fellow students in the street gave me a thrill of excited anticipation for the coming academic year. For a while, I forgot about Sensei. Classes started, and a month or so later, I slumped back into normalcy. I wandered the streets in vague discontentment or cast my eyes around my room, aware of some indefinable lack. The thought of Sensei came into my mind once more. I wanted to see him again, I realized. The first time I went to his house, he was not home. The second time was the following Sunday, I remember. It was a beautiful day with a sort of sky that feels as if it is penetrating your very soul. Once again, Sensei was out. I distinctly remembered him saying in Kamakura that he was almost always at home. In fact, he had said he quite disliked going out. Having now found him absent both times I called, I remembered these words, and somewhere inside me an inexplicable resentment registered. Instead of turning to go, I lingered at the front door, gazing at the maid who had delivered the message. She recognized me and remembered giving Sensei my card last time, so she left me waiting while she retreated inside. Then a lady whom I took to Sensei's wife appeared. I was struck by her beauty. She courteously explained where Sensei had gone. On this day every month, she told me, his habit was to visit the cemetery at Sōseki and offer flowers at one of the graves. He only went out a bare 10 minutes or so ago, she added sympathetically. I thanked her and left. I walked 100 yards or so toward the bustling town, then felt a sudden urge to take a detour by way of Sōseki myself. I might even come across Sensei there, I thought. I swung around and set off. Chapter 5. I passed a field of rice seedlings on my right, then turned into the graveyard. I was walking down its broad, maple-lined Central Avenue when I saw someone who could be Sensei emerging from the tea house at the far end. I went on toward the figure until I could make out the sunlight flashing on the rim of his spectacles. Sensei, I called abruptly. He halted and stared at me. How? How? The repeated word hung strangely in the hushed midday air. I found myself suddenly unable to reply. Did you follow me here? How? He seemed quite calm. His voice was quiet, but a shadow seemed to cloud his face. I explained how I came to be there. Did my wife tell you whose grave I have come to visit? No, she didn't mention that. I see. Yes, she would not have any reason to. After all, she had only just met you. There would be no need to tell you anything. He seemed finally satisfied, but I was puzzled by what he had said. Sensei and I walked together among the graves to the exit. One of the tombstones was inscribed with a foreign name, Isabella so-and-so. Another, evidently belonging to a Christian, read Rojin, servant of God. Next to it stood a stupa with a quotation from the sutras. Buddhahood is innate to all beings. Another gravestone bore the title, Minister Plenipotentiary. I paused at one small grave whose name I could make no sense of and asked Sensei about it. I think that's intended to spell the name Andre. He replied with a wry little smile. I found humor and irony in this great variety of humanity displayed in the names on the tombstones, but I gathered that he did not. As I chattered on about the graves, pointing out this round tombstone or that tall, thin marble pillar, he listened in silence. Finally, he said, You haven't seriously thought about the reality of death yet, have you? I fell silent. Sensei did not speak again. At the end of the cemetery, a great jingo tree stood blocking the sky. It will look lovely before long, Sensei remarked, looking up at it. This tree turns a beautiful color in autumn. The ground is buried deep in golden leaves when they fall. Every month when he came here, I discovered he made a point of passing under this tree. Some distance away, a man had been smoothing the rough earth of a new grave. He paused on his hoe and watched us. We turned left and soon were back on the street. I had nowhere in particular to go, so I continued to walk beside him. He spoke less than usual. It did not make me feel awkward, however, and I strolled along easily beside him. Are you going straight home? I asked. Yes, there's nowhere else I need to go. We fell silent again and walked south down the hill. Is your family grave there? I asked a little later, breaking the silence. No. Whose grave is it? Is it some relation? No. Sensei said no more, and I decided not to pursue the conversation. About 100 yards on, however, he abruptly broke the silence. A friend of mine is buried there. You visit a friend's grave every month? That's right. This is all he told me that day. Chapter 6. I visited Sensei quite often thereafter. He was always at home when I called, and the more I saw of him, the sooner I wanted to visit him again. Yet Sensei's manner toward me never really changed, from the day we first exchanged words to the time when our friendship was well established. He was always quiet, sometimes almost forlorn. From the outset, he seemed to me strangely unapproachable, yet I felt compelled to find a way to get close to him. Perhaps no one else would have had this response. Others might have dismissed it as folly, an impulse of youth. As I feel a certain happy pride in the insight I sought, for later events served to justify my intuition. Sensei was a man who could indeed must love, yet he was unable to open his arms and accept into his heart another who sought to enter. He was, as I have said, always quiet and composed, even serene, yet from time to time an odd shadow would cross his face, like the sudden dark passage of a bird across a window, although it was no sooner there than gone again. The first time I noticed it was when I called out to him in the graveyard at Zoshigaya. For a strange instant, the warm pulse of my blood faltered a little. It was only a momentary miss of a beat, however, and in no time my heart recovered its usual resilient pulse, and I proceeded to forget what I had seen. One evening, just at the end of autumn's warm weather, I was unexpectedly reminded of it again. As I was talking to Sensei, I was for some reason suddenly reminded of the great Jingo tree that he had pointed out to me. A mental calculation told me that his next visit to the grave was 3 days away. My classes would finish at noon that day, so I would have the afternoon free. I turned to Sensei. I wonder if the Jingo tree at Zoshigaya has lost its leaves by now. It won't be quite bare yet, I should think. He looked at me, his eyes staying on me for a long moment. I quickly went on. Would you mind if I go with you next time? I'll enjoy walking around the area with you. I go to visit a grave, not to take a walk. But would not it be nice to go for a walk while you are about it? Sensei did not reply at first, then said finally, my sole purpose in going is to visit the grave. Clearly, he wanted to impress on me the distinction between a grave visit and a mere walk. It occurred to me that he might be making an excuse not to have me along. His tone seemed oddly petulant. I felt an urge to press my case. Well, let me come along anyway and visit the grave too. I'll pay respects with you. In truth, I could not really see the distinction between visiting someone's grave and taking a walk. Sensei's brow darkened a little and a strange light shone in his eyes. Was it annoyance or dislike or fear that I saw hovering there? Instantly, I had a vivid recollection of that shadow on his face when I had called out to him at Zoshigaya. This expression was identical. Sensei began, I have a particular reason that I cannot explain to you for wanting to visit the grave alone. I never even take my wife. Chapter 7. It all struck me as very odd, but my intention in visiting him was not to study or analyze Sensei, so I let it pass. In retrospect, I particularly treasure my memory of that response to Sensei. Because of it, I think I was able to achieve the real human intimacy with him that I later did. If I had chosen to turn the cool and analytical eye of curiosity on Sensei's heart, it would inexorably have snapped the bond of sympathy between us. At the time, of course, I was too young to be aware of any of this. Perhaps this is precisely where its true value lies. If I had made the mistake of responding less than guilelessness, who knows what might have befallen our relationship. I shudder to think of it, the scrutiny of an analytical eye was something Sensei always particularly dreaded. It became my established habit to call on Sensei twice or even 3 times a month. One day he unexpectedly turned to me and asked, what makes you come to see someone like me so often? Well, no particular reason, really. Am I a nuisance, Sensei? I would not say that. Indeed, my visits didn't seem to annoy him. I was aware that he had a very narrow range of social contacts. He had also mentioned that only 2 or 3 of his old school friends were living in Tokyo. Occasionally, a fellow student from his hometown would be there when I called, but none of them seemed to me as close to him as I. I am a lonely man, Sensei said, so I am happy that you come to visit. That's why I asked why you come so often. Why are you lonely? I asked in return. Sensei did not reply. He just looked at me and said, how old are you? I could make no sense of this exchange and went home the day puzzled. 4 days later, however, I was back at his house again. He burst out laughing as soon as he emerged and saw me. "You're here again, eh?" "Yes," I said, laughing too. If anyone else had said this to me, I would surely have felt offended. But coming from Sensei, the words made me positively happy. "I am a lonely man," he repeated that evening. "I am lonely, but I am guessing you may be a lonely man yourself. I am older, so I can withstand loneliness without needing to take action. But for you, it's different. You're young. I sense that you have the urge to act. You want to pit yourself against something." "I'm not at all lonely. No time is as lonely as youth. Why else should you visit me so often?" Here was the same question again. "But even when you are with me," he went on, "you probably still feel somehow lonely. I don't have the strength, you see, to really take on your loneliness and eradicate it for you. In time, you will need to reach out towards someone else. Sooner or later, your feet will no longer feel inclined to take you here." Sensei smiled forlornly as he spoke. Chapter 8. Fortunately, Sensei's prophecy was not fulfilled. Inexperienced as I was, I could not grasp even the most obvious significance of his words, and continued to visit as usual. Before long, I found myself occasionally dining there, which naturally put me in the position of talking to his wife. Like other men, I was not indifferent to women. Being young, however, I had so far had little opportunity to have much to do with girls. Perhaps for this reason, my response to the opposite sex was limited to a keen interest in the unknown women I passed in the street. When I first saw Sensei's wife at the door, she had struck me as beautiful, and every time we met thereafter I thought so again. Otherwise, I found nothing really to say about her. That is not to say that she wasn't special in any way. Rather, she had had no opportunity to reveal her particular qualities to me. I treated her as a kind of appendage to Sensei, and she welcomed me as the young student who visited her husband. Sensei was our sole connection. That is why her beauty is the single impression I remember of her from those early days. One day when I visited, I was given sake. His wife emerged to serve it to me. Sensei was more jovial than usual. "You must have a cup too," he pressed her, offering the little sake cup from which he had drunk. "Oh no, she began, then rather unwillingly accepted the cup. I half filled it for her, and she lifted it to her lips, a pretty frown seizing her forehead. The following conversation then took place between them. This is most unusual," she remarked. "You almost never encourage me to drink." "That's because you don't enjoy it, but it's good to have the occasional drink, you know. It puts you in good spirits." "It doesn't at all. All it does is make me feel terrible, but a bit of sake seems to make you wonderfully cheerful." "Sometimes it does, yes, but not always. What about this evening?" "This evening I feel fine. You should have a little every evening from now on." "I don't think that's a very good idea." "Go on, do, then you won't feel so melancholy." The two of them lived there with only a maid for company, and I generally found the house hushed and silent when I arrived. I never heard loud laughter or raised voices. It sometimes felt as if Sensei and I were the only people in the house. "It would be nice if we had children, you know," she said, turning to me. "Yes, I'm sure," I replied, but I felt no stir of sympathy at her words. I was too young to have children of my own and regarded them as no more than noisy pests. "Shall I adopt one for you?" said Sensei. "Oh dear me, an adopted child," she said, turning to me again. "We'll never have one, you know," Sensei said. She was silent, so I spoke instead. "Why not?" "Divine punishment," he answered, and gave a loud laugh. Chapter 9. Sensei and his wife had a good relationship as far as I could tell. I was not really in a position to judge, of course, since I had never lived under the same roof with them. Still, if he happened to need something while we were in the living room together, it was often his wife rather than the maid whom he asked to fetch it. "Hey, Shizu," he would call, turning toward the door and calling her by name. The words had a gentle ring, I thought, and on those occasions when I stayed for a meal and she joined us, I gained a clearer picture of their relationship. Sensei would sometimes take her out to a concert or or the theater. I also recall two or three occasions when they went off for a week's vacation together. I still have a postcard they sent from the hot springs resort at Hakone, and I received a letter from their visit to Nikko with an autumn leaf enclosed. Such was my general impression of them as a couple. Only one incident disturbed it. One day when I arrived at the house and was on the point of announcing myself at the door, as was my custom, I overheard voices coming from the living room. As I listened, it became evident that this was no normal conversation but an argument. The living room was right next to the entrance hall, and I was close enough to get a clear sense of their general tone, if not the words. I soon understood that the male voice that rose from time to time was Sensei's. The other one was lower, and it was unclear whose it was, but it felt like his wife's. She seemed to be crying. I hesitated briefly in the entrance hall, unsure what to do, then made up my mind and went home again. Back at my lodgings, a strange anxiety gripped me. I tried reading but found I could not concentrate. About an hour later, Sensei arrived below my window and called up to me. Surprised, I opened it and he suggested I come down for a walk. I checked the watch I had tucked into my sash when I set off earlier and saw that it was past 8. I was still dressed in my visiting clothes, so I went straight out to meet him. That evening, we drank beer together. As a rule, Sensei did not drink much. If a certain amount of alcohol failed to produce the desired effect, he was disinclined to experiment by drinking more. "This isn't working today," he remarked with a wry smile. "You can't cheer up?" I asked sympathetically. I still felt disturbed by the argument I had heard. It produced a sharp pain in me, like a fish bone stuck in my throat. I could not decide whether to confess to Sensei that had overheard it, and my indecision made me unusually fidgety. Sensei was the first to speak about the matter. "You're not yourself tonight, are you?" he said. "I'm feeling rather out of sorts too, actually. You noticed that?" I could not reply. As a matter of fact, I had a bit of quarrel with my wife earlier. I got stupidly upset by it. Why? I could not bring myself to say the word quarrel. "My wife misunderstands me. I tell her so, but she won't believe me. I'm afraid I lost my temper with her." "How does she misunderstand you?" Sensei made no attempt to respond to this. "If I was the sort of person she thinks I am," he said, "I would not be suffering like this." But I was unable to imagine how Sensei was suffering. Chapter 10. We walked back in silence. Then after quite some time, Sensei spoke. "I have done wrong. I left home angry and my wife will be worrying about me. Women are to be pitied, you know. My wife had not a soul except me to turn to." He paused, and then, seeming to expect no response from me, he went on. "But putting it that way makes her husband sound like the strong one, which is rather a joke. You, now, how do you see me, I wonder? Do I strike you as strong or as weak?" "Somewhere in between," I replied. Sensei seemed a little startled. He fell silent again and walked on without speaking further. The road back to Sensei's house passed very near my lodgings, but when we reached the point, it did not feel right to part with him. "Shall I see you to your house?" I asked. He raised a quick defensive hand. "It's late. Off you go. I must be off too, for my wife's sake." For my wife's sake? These words warmed my heart. Thanks to them, I slept in peace that night, and they stayed with me for a long time to come. They told me that the trouble between Sensei and his wife was nothing serious, and I felt it safe to conclude, from my subsequent constant comings and goings at the house, that such quarrels were actually rare. Indeed, Sensei once confided to me, "I have only ever known one woman in my life. No one besides my wife has really ever appealed to me as a woman. And likewise for her, I am the only man. Given this, we should be the happiest of couples." I no longer remember the context in which he said this, so I cannot really explain why he should have made such a confession and to me. But I do remember that he spoke earnestly and seemed calm. The only thing that struck me as strange was that final phrase, "We should be the happiest of couples." Why did he say "should be"? Why not say simply that we were? That they were? This alone disturbed me. Even more puzzling was the somehow forceful tone in which he spoke the words. Sensei had every reason to be happy, but was he? In fact, I wondered. I could not repress my doubt, but it lasted only a moment, then was buried. Sometime later, I stopped by when Sensei happened to be out and I had a chance to talk directly with his wife. Sensei had gone to Shinbashi station to see off a friend who was sailing abroad that day from Yokohama. Customarily, those taking a ship from Yokohama would set off on the boat train from Shinbashi at 8:30 in the morning. I had arranged with Sensei to stop by that morning at 9, as I wanted his opinion on a certain book. Once there, I learned of his last-minute decision to see off his friend as a gesture of thanks for the trouble he had taken to pay Sensei a special farewell visit the day before. Sensei had left instructions that he would soon be back, so I was to stay there and await his return. And so it came about that, as I waited in the living room, his wife and I talked.